So I will speak in English. Thank you very much to Jean and to the organizers for inviting me. My talk will focus on the period between 1920 and 1924, when the Civil War ended, the new economic policy was adopted, and economic recovery began. When I began researching this, I knew that during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had become deeply divided from the workers in whose name they claimed to govern. This was partly because choices by all political forces were constrained by circumstances. I wanted to know what happened to that relationship between the Bolsheviks and the workers once some of those constraints were removed. So I focused on the period after the Civil War, when the Bolsheviks governed free from the threat of immediate defeat for the first time. This was a time when people could start thinking not only about where supply was going to come from tomorrow, but about shaping a new post-capitalist society. As the most optimistic revolutionaries of that time would have said, thinking about building a new world. So I hope that the talk will throw some light on the issue of the evolution of the new Soviet elite, which was discussed in the last panel. The talk summarizes points from my book, which was published in 2008, which was based on research in the archives in Moscow. The research focused on grassroots militants. And I'll talk about 5 different things. First, how the working class emerged from the Civil War. Second, working class politics outside the Bolshevik Party. Third, mass mobilization campaigns. Fourth, the economic recovery. And fifth, conclusions. So first, how the working class emerged from the Civil War. Working class organization had been weakened during the Civil War, but not destroyed. There was a dramatic dispersal of urban population. David Mandel spoke about it. Isaac Deutscher famously wrote, quote, "The proletarian dictatorship was triumphant, but the proletariat had nearly vanished," unquote. But in the 1970s and the 1980s, social historians corrected that rather one-sided picture. They showed that many young men went into the army, but the skilled older workers usually did not. And among those that remained, political and trade union activity continued. In Moscow, that was true in the metalworking factories and in the textile factories. In the spring of 1921, after the Civil War ended, the problems of food supply and transport caused a food crisis in Moscow and Petrograd, similar to the sort of crises that people elsewhere in Russia had suffered all through the Civil War. There was a wave of protests that started with strikes in January and continued with mass meetings and demonstrations in February. The workers' demands had much in common with those that were raised by the Kronstadt sailors in the uprising of 1921. But there was no coordination. In fact, the workers' movement was already going down when the Kronstadt revolt began. The workers' movement raised economic demands and broader political demands. The economic demands were directed against the policies associated with war communism. The workers demanded the abolition of grain requisitioning, free trade with the countryside, free movement of labour between factories. There was an important conference in early February 1921 in Moscow of metalworkers delegates, so that's representatives of the best organised workers in the city. And a resolution was passed there demanding that the grain requisitioning be replaced with a tax in kind. 1 month later, that was the policy that was adopted by the Communist Party, and it was the starting point of the new economic policy. But also at such meetings, workers often demanded the equalization of rations. That meant an end to corrupt practices by which party members and the emerging bureaucracy assured extra food supplies for themselves, for example, by claiming rations simultaneously for 3 or 4 jobs, or just by stealing stuff. The political demands in this movement were aimed at making Soviet rule more democratic. Resolutions were passed urging the restoration of the freedoms of speech and assembly. When militants were arrested in the factories, which happened occasionally, they were very often very quick and vigorous protests. The political demands were more pronounced in Petrograd than in Moscow, and of course most pronounced of all at Kronstadt. I think everybody in this audience is familiar with the main facts of what happened at Kronstadt, but it's worth remembering. The main platform document adopted there called for the election of Soviets by secret ballot, an end to privileges for the Communist Party, and some more far-reaching political reforms. The Kronstadt revolt has been described by some historians as a, quote, third revolution, unquote. But the lack of coordination with the workers' movement and the tone of these resolutions suggest that it was not. I would understand it as a movement to renew Soviet democracy. So the second point is about working class politics outside the party. To my mind, the most interesting political trend among workers in Moscow was the so-called non-partyist group. They were not just non-party, that is, not members of any party, but they were non-partyist. That is, they saw the rejection of party organization as a matter of principle. At this time, the non-Bolshevik socialist parties had been put outside the law. There was no legal restriction on membership, but in practice, their members were arrested, their newspapers were closed, and their meetings were subject to harassment. This has led some historians to assume that the non-partyists were actually Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries hiding their identity. But research in the archives shows that this was not the case in the main. Some of these non-partyists were former members of those organizations, but others were former Bolsheviks. Others were syndicalists who renounced the party form in principle. Others were people who'd been active in 1917 but had not joined any political group. Separately from the non-partyists, there was a significant group of former Bolsheviks in Moscow who had quit the Bolshevik Party in the spring of 1921. Some of them participated in the Workers' and Peasants' Socialist Party led by Vasily Panyushkin, which was suppressed after a few months of political work. In 1920, so the year before, those people had been in an opposition alliance within the party comprising the Democratic Centralists, the Workers' Opposition, and other smaller groups. That alliance at the end of 1920 came very close, within a few votes, of taking control of the Moscow party organization, but narrowly failed. In Moscow in 1921, there were elections to the city Soviet, and the way I see this is that the Bolshevik leaders saw this as a way of drawing a line under the Civil War and the crisis of January and February and moving on with economic reconstruction. The Bolsheviks won a majority in these elections, but only because the white-collar workers and officials from government departments in Moscow, which accounted for about half the delegates to the Soviet, voted for Bolsheviks. Most of the large factories, that is, the workers in whose name this workers' government claimed to rule, most of the large factories returned non-party delegates, and they made up more than 1/4 of the total of the delegates of the Soviet. And the minutes of the first meeting are very revealing. The non-partyists appealed to the Bolsheviks to work jointly in order to reconstruct the economy. The Bolsheviks rejected these overtures and used their majority to make sure that none of these non-partyists, who represented the largest factories, none of these non-partyists were elected to the Soviet executive. They also ruled that the non-partyists were not allowed to operate as a fraction on the Soviet. And the minutes of the Soviet during 1921 and 1922 show that it soon became an empty talking shop, which was used to rubber stamp decisions already taken by party committees. We can see here that the degeneration of the Soviet was not only due to the unfavorable circumstances, but also to this political intolerance demonstrated towards the workers that the Bolsheviks, in whose name the Bolsheviks were governing the country. Why were the Bolsheviks so intolerant of such workers? To answer this, we can perhaps quote an exchange at the 11th Party Congress in 1922 between Lenin and Alexander Shliapnikov, the leader of the workers' opposition in the Bolshevik Party in 1920. Lenin was talking about the problems in the factories and the political division between the government and the workers, because he, like all Bolsheviks, was very concerned about this. And he complained, quote, "Those in the factories are not the proletariat, but casual elements of all kinds," unquote. Shliapnikov responded to Lenin, and this always struck me as a good response, that Lenin and others were, quote, "painting the proletariat in false colors," unquote. And Shliapnikov added, and I liked this bit when I read it, quote, "We will never have a different or better working class. We need to be satisfied with the one we have," unquote. So the next part is about mass mobilization campaigns. The Bolshevik Party was managing its relationship with the working class in 1921-22 in a way that confounded the aspirations to participatory democracy of 1917. With the party in state power, such aspirations were overwhelmed by the vanguardist aspects of its ideology. The working class, if indeed it existed, and I've just mentioned to you the discussion between Shliapnikov and Lenin on that point, if the working class existed, it was seen as a passive force. Rather than participating in political decision-making, the class was to be mobilized for purposes that were decided for it by the party. I'll give you two examples of these mass mobilization campaigns which I think were very symptomatic. The first was the campaign to seize church valuables in order to fund relief for famine victims on the Volga. One could argue that the motivation of this campaign was quite cynical. The famine was obviously not caused by a lack of cash resources at the center, but by a poor harvest, by all the accumulated problems from the Civil War, and by the collapse of the transport system. Nevertheless, the government saw it as an opportunity for anti-religious propaganda and urged workers to sequester golden religious icons to fund famine relief. In some factories, Mensheviks and non-party militants put forward slightly different proposals, such as forming support groups to travel to the famine-hit areas to help, to monitor how the proceeds of the sale of the valuables would be used. But such departures from the party line were denounced by Bolshevik party members. A second campaign was organized during the trial of the members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party leadership. These leaders had participated in the anti-Bolshevik government formed in Samara in 1918. They had taken the other side during the Civil War. But the purpose of the demonstrations was to raise the slogan that the death penalty should be used. This is significant because the abolition of the death penalty had been an important democratic slogan in 1917. Large demonstrations were held on weekdays, and factory managements were instructed to bring workers onto the streets. Both the political content and the form of these demonstrations were attacks on Soviet democracy. So, to my mind, as somebody who's a lifelong participant in the workers' movement, and David wondered earlier whether people still regard themselves as socialist, I certainly do. This makes me think that the Bolsheviks did not always have choices. They were often constrained, but there were times when they did have choices. And I think taking a lot of workers out onto the streets to demand the death penalty for anybody, given all the circumstances, was a bad choice. At the same time, forms of workplace and Soviet democracy that had survived the Civil War were being eroded. The debate about factory committees and trade unions participating in industrial administration was already over. There would be no such participation. And while trade unions were given the task of, quote, defending workers' interests, unquote, in practice, the right to strike was constrained by the security services and by the management, whose standard reaction to any strike was to sack the organizers. Moreover, these organizers were usually expelled from the trade unions. In the Soviets, the process that Eric mentioned in the first session, the proliferation of bureaucratic structures, continued, and the secretary of the Moscow Bolshevik Party described this, to my mind, very memorably. He said that the party organization was a pump, quote, sucking in members and pumping them into Soviet institutions, unquote, so that few Bolshevik activists remained in the factories. This made matters worse. So the fourth point is about the economic recovery. The new economic policy created the opportunity for economic recovery. Industries were reorganized in trusts, and market mechanisms were introduced into management. On the one hand, this resulted in unemployment, particularly among women who were sacked to make way for male workers coming out of the army. On the other hand, industrial production began to recover, and by the middle of the 1920s had returned to the level of 1913, which, after the years of hardship of the First World War and the Civil War, was what workers really craved. Considering these processes from the standpoint of the advance or retreat of socialist and democratic elements in the revolution, one is struck by the force with which, as the economy recovered, old hierarchies and forms of alienation reasserted themselves. And I would say reasserted themselves behind the backs of the actors. There was a rapid accumulation of material privilege by the elite in the state and industrial management. In 1922 and 1923, the top-down appointment of party officials, which was mentioned in the first session, became a system. These party officials and also managers in the trusts gathered personal wealth in a way that had simply not been possible during the Civil War. This wealth was hardly comparable to the wealth of propertied classes in other countries, but it was unattainable to even the best paid workers. So a survey was conducted and published in 1923, and it found that 14% of, I've written here civil servants, but of responsible workers was the phrase that was used. So 14% of people in official jobs admitted to earning more than 8 times the minimum wage. Some of them admitted to earning more than 30 times the minimum wage, even though 8 times was the legal maximum. And of course, this survey did not reflect semi-legal or illegal income, which we know from all the documents existed in quantities. By 1922, the party was officially sanctioning some of these material privileges. A party conference resolution allowed officials to earn senior management grade salaries plus 50% and guaranteed them valuable benefits such as housing, medical support, and education. So my thought about this is that hardly any of these people had a standard of living even comparable to what I have in my street, where workers in London are my neighbours, and the sort of things we were accustomed to. But this seems to me not to be the issue. The issue is that with such decisions, the party approved inequalities and in this way contributed to an atmosphere in which a social elite could reform more easily in a supposedly socialist society. So my conclusions are 3 conclusions. First, the forms of hierarchy and alienation reappeared in the new society at a speed and with a force that caught Bolsheviks and workers alike unawares. This was a classic example of historical forces working behind people's backs, in spite of the great sense of agency that 1917 had given them. Secondly, I would describe the Bolshevik approach to the working class in the early 1920s as a social contract. The party said to the party said to workers, "We will ensure that your living standards recover their previous level. We will provide welfare benefits and women's rights similar to those in other industrialized countries. In return, you will observe labor discipline. You may complain about factory-level problems in a way that you could not under the old regime. But if you engage in political activity outside of or against the Bolshevik Party, you will be isolated and repressed." And this isolation and repression applied not only to non-Bolshevik socialists, but to those former Bolsheviks who left the party after the Civil War. Thirdly, this rolling back of the socialist aspects of the revolution, and later, so in the late 1920s, the advance of Stalinism, were conditioned by many powerful factors over which the Bolsheviks had no control. We've spoken about those, the conditions of the Civil War, the general poverty of the country, and so on. And to my mind, it seems unlikely that different choices in the early 1920s could have substantially altered Soviet history. But different choices may have made possible different types of resistance to the reimposition of exploitative class relations and dictatorship. However, Bolshevism also left legacies of authoritarianism, vanguardism, and statism that were influential and damaging in labour movements internationally over the last century. To my mind, overcoming such legacies and disentangling them from the great progressive legacies of the revolution is part of the continuing process of social liberation.